Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world where personal space is a luxury you can't even imagine. You open your eyes on a straw-stuffed mattress laid across hard-packed earth. There's no bedroom door to shut behind you because there's no bedroom. In fact, your entire house is just one open room, maybe two if you're lucky. And your parents' siblings, and sometimes even the neighbors' chickens, are all part of the architectural plan. Welcome to medieval domestic life, where even your most private moments have an audience, human or otherwise. You probably won't survive this one with your sense of modesty intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is as you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge barefoot across the cold dirt floor of your medieval home. It's drafty. It smells faintly of turnips, wood smoke, and something more barnyard. The hearth is glowing in the corner, the only source of warmth and light. You glance around and remember there's nowhere to go. Literally nowhere. Your entire family is packed into this one shared space like pickled vegetables in a clay jar. Your mother's already stirring oats, your father's snoring on a bench, and your younger siblings are definitely awake and pretending they aren't watching. Beds, if you can call them, that are sometimes just heaps of straw in a corner. If you're fortunate, there's a single great bed shared among multiple family members, and there are no curtains, no partitions, no locks. This is your life and privacy, at least the kind we think of today just doesn't exist yet. In medieval Europe, especially among peasants, the idea of separating life into neat little compartments, eating here, sleeping there, romance behind closed doors was laughable. Houses had to be functional. Space was precious. Livestock often slept indoors to protect them from thieves or frost. And if you wanted to say, cuddle your spouse after the kids drifted off, you did it as quietly as you could and hoped the goats wouldn't start bleating. But even silence didn't guarantee secrecy. One 14th century friar wrote that nothing done by night goes unnoticed by the cock, meaning the rooster. But also, let's be honest, probably the neighbors. Historians still argue whether this communal living dulled people's sensitivity to private matters, or if social norms simply adjusted around the lack of solitude. Was modesty redefined in context, or did everyone just pretend not to notice what they clearly noticed? Now, some might imagine the wealthier households had it better. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But that's for section 2. For now, just picture this. You're a newlywed peasant sharing a single room with your in-laws, 4 cousins, 2 sheep, and a very alert dog. Your first night together. Let's just say it involved a lot of holding hands and praying. Someone fell asleep quickly. There's also a strange comfort to it all. You weren't expected to be entirely hidden. Life was loud, earthy, and inherently public. Even intimacy was just one more natural event, like the bread rising or the pig squealing at dawn. And it didn't stop inside the home. In many villages, homes were clustered close together. Walls were thin. Open shutters let in light and noise. Curious children, gossiping elders, and the local busybody named Agnes all part of the ambient soundtrack. In this world, the idea of the bedroom as a sacred, sealed-off space for intimacy is centuries away. Right now, you sleep when you can love when it's quiet, and accept that someone, whether sibling, so, or saint, is probably within earshot. A fringe detail, In some parts of medieval Europe, married couples were even expected to avoid excessive privacy lest they be accused of harboring sinful desires. Privacy, ironically, was seen as suspicious. Why hide if you've got nothing to hide? So next time your phone buzzes with a hotel ad for intimate escapes, remember that back in the Middle Ages, the only getaway you had was a quick trip behind the haystack. And even then, don't count on being alone. You managed to claw your way out of peasant life, well done, and now you're a minor noble. You live in a manor house. There's actual stone beneath your feet. The ceilings are high, the beds are huge, and the tapestries are gorgeous. You might expect that with wealth and status comes privacy, right? Wrong. Let's step into your new bedchamber, which sounds far more exclusive than it is. You might have a 4-poster bed with embroidered curtains, sure, but don't expect solitude. Servants bustle in and out at all hours, stoking the fire, refilling the chamber pot, adjusting your blankets, and probably judging your feet. Even at night, a personal attendant or two sleeps just feet away in the same room, either on benches or on rush mats ready to assist you if needed, or more often simply because there's nowhere else for them to go. And forget locking doors. Doors, if they exist at all, are more symbolic than secure. Most noble households operated on a kind of open access policy. People wandered freely from room to room. Whether they were guests, gossips, or your cousin, who's always just stopping by, they'd drift through the halls like well-dressed ghosts. This wasn't just laziness, it was political. In noble circles, being seen mattered. Visibility was power. Your daily life, even what time you woke up, how you dressed, what you ate, was part of a carefully managed public performance. Privacy didn't just lack importance, it was considered dangerous. Secrets bred suspicion. And if there's one thing medieval courts hated, it was whispers behind closed doors. One 13th century French courtier noted that even the king's sleeping quarters were filled with scribes, guards, and attendants, not to protect him, but to witness his daily routine. Witnesses meant truth, and truth protected reputations. Nothing invites scandal like silence. Historians still debate whether the wealthy even wanted privacy, or if they were conditioned to need an audience. Think of it like a medieval version of reality TV, everyone watching, judging, and forming opinions you couldn't control. Except instead of cameras, it was your steward and 3 laundry maids watching you adjust your nightshirt. Let's say you're married. Your spouse sleeps beside you sometimes. But beside doesn't always mean alone with. Royal couples were often surrounded by courtiers during even the most intimate conversations. One chronicler described how a duke and duchess once tried to share a quiet moment behind their bed curtains, only to realize 2 bored scribes had been documenting the entire exchange from a nearby bench. Romantic right. You try sneaking off to a more secluded corner of your castle. Maybe a little tower room bad news again. Castles weren't built for privacy. They were built for defense and social signaling. Sound carries in stone halls. Footsteps echo, and the doors, if they close at all, might creak louder than a town crier. And then there's the furniture itself. The great bed was often a shared item. In large households, multiple guests might be expected to sleep in the same room, sometimes even the same bed, especially during feast days or political visits. It wasn't weird. It was just Wednesday, a fringe tidbit. Some noble households employed what were called watchers, trusted individuals who were paid not just to attend to noble couples, but also to observe them, particularly on the wedding night. It was believed that physical evidence of consummation, think stained sheets or awkward morning-after testimonials was essential proof of a marriage's legitimacy. In fact, in some 15th century regions, noble newlyweds weren't considered fully married until witnesses had seen or heard enough to verify activity. And yes, that means what you think it means. You roll over in your lavish bed, trying to imagine a single moment when you're truly alone. Even prayers are often shared, whispered aloud in chorus with the chaplain or companion. And if you think closing your eyes means the staff stops watching, think again. Medieval servants were trained to observe and remember, especially when gossip was currency. Which leads us to a cruel irony. The richer you are, the less privacy you get. Nobles lived like goldfish in a glass bowl, watched, envied, judged, and never truly alone. So next time you see a fancy four-poster bed in a museum, don't picture a romantic escape. Picture 3 maids, 2 grooms, and a bored falconer, all trying not to stare as you try to say goodnight. You've had enough of noble nonsense and decide to chase holiness instead. So now you're in a monastery or maybe a convent, hoping for peace, silence, and the kind of privacy that lets you think deep thoughts and avoid weird glances. But guess what? The monks are watching you constantly. You wake up on a narrow wooden cot in a long hall full of other sleeping bodies. These are your brothers, or sisters if you're in a nunnery. Either way, you are not alone, not when you sleep, not when you pray, not even when you change robes. Communal dormitories were the monastic norm. There's a whole architectural philosophy here. Transparency breeds discipline. Everything is open. Everyone is accountable. And while you might assume monks and nuns were all about solitude, medieval religious life was obsessed with visible obedience. So no sneaking away for personal moments or quiet distractions. Your room doesn't even have walls. The great dormitory was often built with long sight lines, so superiors could check if you were really asleep or, more importantly, not doing anything unholy under the covers. Some monasteries even used what were called night watchers, designated monks who stayed up in shifts to observe the sleeping brethren. Their job was part spiritual, part disciplinary. They weren't spying exactly, but they were absolutely taking notes. In fact, one 12th century rulebook insists that monks should sleep in garments girded and modest to discourage temptation even in dreams. Historians still argue whether this intense surveillance was more about preventing sin or about maintaining hierarchy. Was it protection or paranoia? After all, religious communities were full of politics, power struggles, and deeply human impulses. Privacy made space for deviation, and deviation was dangerous. And don't expect your vows to shield you from gossip. If a monk was caught whispering in the dark, visiting the wrong cell, or even sleeping too peacefully next to the wrong person, tongues wagged. In some cases, they were hauled before the abbot to explain themselves, yes, even if nothing actually happened. Now, you may be thinking, surely the clergy were better at self-control, and to that history says, define better. A quirky tidbit. One particularly dramatic 14th century abbot ordered the windows of his monks' cells to be shrunk because he believed too much light encouraged idle temptation. Meanwhile, another monastery redesigned its layout so every hallway had at least 2 turning points, ensuring you couldn't vanish around a corner without someone eventually seeing where you went. Monastic architecture was basically a medieval CCTV system. Even confessions weren't exactly private. While the words shared might be sacred, the mere act of going to confess to whom and how often was public knowledge. It wasn't hard to connect the dots when Brother Thomas visited the confessor every day after sunset, or when Sister Agnes suddenly changed her seat in the choir stall after one particularly intense sermon on bodily desires. And then, of course, there's the matter of spiritual visions. One nun, in a fit of divine inspiration, claimed an angel had visited her in her sleep and embraced her heart. Was it mystical poetry or medieval euphemism? Scholars still debate that one. Either way, the abbess ordered a new set of sleeping arrangements just in case the angel returned with ideas. Even silence could be suspect. If you were too quiet for too long, others worried you were hiding something, doubt perhaps, or secret sin. It's almost as if the monastery wanted you to live like a goldfish in a bowl, always visible, always legible. The more devout your community, the more eyes on you. The irony. These were people who had chosen lives of seclusion, and yet their every breath was tracked like a heartbeat in a hospital room. So as you roll over in your simple robe, clutching your rosary beneath the blanket, you realize even in the holiest corners of the Middle Ages, you're never truly alone. You might be celibate, but you are definitely not private. You're starting to get the feeling that in the Middle Ages, nothing was sacred. And now you learn that your sex life, that belonged to the church. Yes, really. You wake up in your humble home beside your spouse, the fire still glowing faintly in the hearth. And before you've even had breakfast, it's time to talk about your latest confession. Specifically, how often you and your partner are doing it, whether it's on approved days and whether you're, shall we say, conducting yourselves in the approved fashion. Because in this era, the church isn't just concerned with your soul, it has opinions about your bedroom schedule too. And those opinions, they are detailed. Medieval canon law laid out a calendar of no-go days for sex. Sundays, number Fridays, also nomos. Saints' days, definitely not. Advent, Lent, the eve of communion, and certain phases of the moon. Guess again. By the time you're done ticking off all the restrictions, you're left with a handful of okay days scattered throughout the year. And even then, you'd better be doing it face to face in silence, and with no trace of pleasure. Not kidding. Clergy were expected to ask married couples about this stuff. In confession. Sometimes even during premarital counseling. The idea wasn't to pry, it was to guide the flock toward what was considered a chaste and godly union, which meant no funny business, no experimenting, and certainly no lustful thoughts even if you were married. A mainstream fact here, the penitential manual's guides for confessors actually included flowcharts for determining whether a sexual act was a sin, a small sin, or a capital offense. Some even described what kinds of penance to assign. One 11th century manual suggested 30 days of fasting if you'd been too enthusiastic. 30 days for enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether these regulations were enforced rigidly or just existed as moral ideals. Some scholars suggest clergy were more lenient in practice. Others point to records of couples being shamed or fined for ungodly behavior behind closed doors. Though, as we've already established, there weren't really any doors to close. Here's a quirky bit: in some regions, priests would actually advise married couples how to sleep to avoid accidental temptation, like sleeping back to back, or wrapping oneself in layers of cloth as a chastity barrier. One English manual even recommended placing a crucifix between spouses at night. Medieval romance now with 100% more religious iconography. And when someone failed to meet these standards, it didn't just stay between them and God. Imagine this: you've confessed that you and your partner got carried away one night, maybe on the wrong day or in the wrong position. The priest assigns penance, but word spreads. Somehow the baker's wife starts looking at you differently. A neighbor suddenly quotes scripture about lustful hearts when you walk by. Gossip in medieval towns traveled faster than a falcon on a feast day. Remember, these were small communities, and church teachings weren't confined to the pulpit. Sin was public business. Sermons often addressed common moral failings. Entire categories of Sunday preaching were devoted to sexual behavior. Sometimes the message was subtle, other times not at all. Some preachers even got theatrical. One famous friar in Florence gave fiery sermons comparing immoral spouses to pigs rutting in a sty. He was a hit, by the way. Crowds loved it. Nothing like hearing your sins shouted with flair in the town square. And let's not forget the enforcement side. In particularly strict towns, there were moral patrols, citizens tasked with identifying sinful behavior. Think medieval neighborhood watch, but instead of stopping theft, they're sniffing out fornication. Your private life was so interwoven with church doctrine that it became, well, not private. It was scrutinized, cataloged, preached about, and used as an example for others. You weren't just living your life, you were performing it according to divine standards, or at least trying not to fail too publicly. So the next time your priest asks how you're doing, maybe don't answer with too much honesty. You never know who's listening in the confessional line. You've tried to follow the rules. You've nodded along in confession, stuck to the holy calendar, even remembered to sleep facing the wall with one arm draped over your spouse like a chaste human sash. And yet, one clumsy mistake, one poorly timed kiss in a barn, one overlong gaze at the baker's son, and suddenly you're the star of this week's public humiliation ritual. Because in the Middle Ages, if you got caught doing anything remotely scandalous, you didn't just get a scolding. You got a stage. You rise early to the sound of a bell, not because you're pious, but because you've been summoned to do penance. The village square is already busy, the gossipers sharpened and ready. You're marched through the streets with a sign hanging from your neck, or worse, wearing nothing but a shift, or rough sackcloth barefoot, maybe even with ashes sprinkled on your head. And yes, this is happening before breakfast. Public penance was more than punishment. It was moral theater. The church and sometimes local officials used it to warn others correct behavior and remind the community that sin wasn't a private matter. You sinned in the flesh, you repented in full view. The specifics depended on what you did and where. Kissing before marriage. A mild walk with a shame board might do. Caught in the act with someone who wasn't your spouse. That's a multi-week humiliation tour, often paired with fasting fines, and in some cases, an icy bath in a nearby river. Fun for the whole village. One 14th century case in northern France involved a couple forced to parade through town, bound together by ropes, with the man dragging a log behind him as a symbol of his lustful burden. He tripped twice. The crowd laughed. A fringe tidbit. In some towns, people were required to ring a bell or carry a candle as they walked their shame circuit, so no one could accidentally miss their moment of disgrace. And yes, these penalties applied to both men and women, though predictably, women usually bore the heavier social consequences. A woman caught in adultery might lose her dowry, be shaved bald, or be forced to wear an identifying mark for months. Men. They were often fined and then whispered about at the tavern. Progress. Historians still debate whether these punishments were meant to actually reform the guilty or if they were more about reinforcing social order, making examples of people to keep everyone else in line. Was the goal forgiveness or fear? You pass a familiar corner and catch the eye of your neighbor. She doesn't smile. She doesn't look surprised either. You realize she probably saw it coming. Maybe she saw you and your partner slip behind that hedgerow. Maybe she heard something through the thin walls of your shared cottage. Maybe she just read your blushes like the village newspaper. There's no hiding here. Once the whisper mill starts, it's impossible to stop. A careless laugh, an untied shoe, a late return from the field, it's all data, and people love data. Even if you weren't caught in the act, suspicion alone could trigger consequences. Rumors were enough to land you in front of the bishop, especially if you were already unpopular. And forget arguing testimonies from upright citizens who might also be your rivals, often carried more weight than whatever you claimed happened, or didn't. One woman in 1320s England was accused of unchaste conduct after being seen talking to a man near a pigsty. That was it. Just talking. She was sentenced to 2 weeks of public penance and church attendance, during which the community was encouraged to pray for her return to virtue. Oink, oink. But don't get too bitter, because sometimes these rituals weren't all gloom and doom. In some towns, public penance turned into something oddly festive. Crowds gathered, children laughed, bakers handed out rolls. One friar complained that it was becoming entertainment, not repentance. They cheer the sinner, he wrote, as if sin were a sport. So here you are, barefoot, head bowed, carrying a wooden symbol of your indiscretion, while a child offers you a piece of pie. Medieval morality was never simple, and yet, after your walk, after your prayer, after your penance, something happens. The whispers fade, the shame lightens, people move on. Because in a world without privacy, being publicly flawed just made you part of the crowd. You're starting to feel like every aspect of medieval life was basically lived under a spotlight, and now you've wandered into one of the brightest of all the public bathhouse. Don't let the candlelit mood fool you. This place is the medieval equivalent of a spa, a town hall, a dating app, and if you're not careful, a source of divine disappointment. You push open the wooden door and are immediately hit with warm, herbal-scented air. Steam curls around arched stone walls. Naked bodies, men, women, sometimes together, sometimes separate, move through the haze with the ease of people who haven't been taught to fear bare skin. You feel exposed, but also invisible. No one bats an eye. Because here, bathing isn't private. It's the place to be seen. Bathhouses in the Middle Ages were surprisingly common, especially in urban centers. Towns like Paris, London, and Nuremberg had dozens, some small, some grand, many co-ed, depending on local laws, or well, the laxity of enforcement. They weren't secret dens of sin. They were public accepted and often municipally regulated. You take your seat in a warm tub next to a baker, a midwife, and a guy who's clearly trying too hard to look relaxed. This is social hour. People eat here, drink here, strike business deals, propose marriage, complain about church sermons, or sneak meaningful glances across the steam. And yes, this mingling led to concerns. Clergy and moralists were not huge fans of bathhouses. One bishop called them the devil's teacups, which is delightful imagery. The problem wasn't bathing itself. Cleanliness was still sometimes next to godliness. It was the mixing, the murmuring, the laughter that sounded just a little too flirtatious. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were mostly innocent or mostly carnal. Some records frame them as essential urban hygiene centers. Others hint at brothel-adjacent vibes, with certain bathhouse attendants offering extra services. It really depended on the city and the decade. In some towns, laws tried to separate men's and women's hours. But those rules were about as stable as a wooden tub in flood season. By the time night fell, co-ed soaking was often back on the menu. A quirky fact: some bathhouses offered musical accompaniment flutes and lutes drifting through the steam while people soaked. In one infamous German town bathhouse, staff were required to wear specific uniforms, but only during daylight. After sundown, all bets and clothes were off. And yet, despite the occasional scandal, many communities defended their bathhouses. They were good for public health. They kept lice and disease at bay. And frankly, they made long winters a little more bearable. Wouldn't you be a little friendlier after a hot soak and a roast duck leg? You look around and realize something strange. No one here is embarrassed. Not the old merchant with a belly like a barrel, not the nun in disguise whispering to her companion, not the young lovers sitting just a bit too close. There's a kind of freedom in this steamy transparency, an acceptance that bodies exist, and sometimes those bodies flirt. Of course, it couldn't last forever. The Reformation, the plague, and changing attitudes about nudity would eventually dampen, literally, the bathhouse culture. But for centuries, these places were buzzing, bubbling hubs of semi-nude community bonding. So here in this moment, in your borrowed bath tunic, shoulder to shoulder with strangers and neighbors and maybe even a crush from the market, you understand in the medieval world, privacy didn't mean isolation. It meant presence, being known, being seen. And yes, sometimes being seen too much. Let's say you're not wealthy enough for a stone manor, or lucky enough to live near a city bathhouse. You're just a regular medieval peasant, and your house is barely big enough to store your grain, let alone your secrets. Where then do you go when the mood strikes? Simple outside. You slip out after sunset, careful not to wake the others. The thatch door creaks anyway. The dog grunts. Your boots crunch softly on the frozen earth. And soon you're behind the barn under the moonlight, trying to find a patch of privacy in a world that rarely grants it. Because for the medieval poor, if there was any such thing as privacy, it came from the open air. Peasant homes were tiny, crammed with relatives' livestock tools, and occasionally your uncle's questionable fiddle playing. There was no personal space, certainly no room for romance. And with so many people sleeping in the same room, and sometimes the same bed, it's no surprise that couples had to get creative. The woods, the fields, the haylofts, the mills. These became the unofficial venues for late-night rendezvous. Even hedgerows and cemetery walls weren't off-limits. If it was quiet and shadowy and not currently housing a pig, it might work. Historians still argue whether this rural privacy was liberating or just another sign of social hardship. Was it a kind of natural rebellion, an earthy improvisational love life? Or was it simply necessity born of the fact that peasants lived like packed sardines with nowhere to breathe? Either way, the result was the same. Intimacy didn't happen behind bedroom doors. It happened behind hay bales under trees and occasionally on someone's roof. Yes, there are records. And this outdoor intimacy wasn't limited to lovers. In some communities, sleeping arrangements were so tight that even bodily functions had to be taken outside. You'd see people trudging off in the early morning mist chamber pot, in one hand, dignity trailing behind. A quirky tidbit. In a few areas of England, folklore warned against kissing under certain trees at night. Why? Because those trees were considered courting trees, places where couples met in secret, and where the spirits of jilted lovers supposedly lingered. Romantic and slightly cursed. Of course, this rural improvisation had risks. You could get caught, or bitten, or fined. Some towns imposed penalties for indecent conduct in fields and along roadsides. One German law from the 14th century warned couples not to tangle under the moon within view of the harvest path, which is one way to put it. Still, people did it, often, with varying levels of discretion, because even if the act was private, the result, whispers, rumors, pregnancies, rarely stayed that way. And in close-knit villages, the line between secret and everyone knows, but no one says it, was vanishingly thin. A shout in the woods. Maybe it's a fox, or maybe it's Agnes tripping on her petticoat. Again. And if you were unmarried, outdoor trysts carried even higher stakes. Premarital intimacy wasn't just frowned upon, it could ruin reputations. But that didn't stop people. They just got quieter, faster, or sneakier. Some even used specific meeting signals, flowers on windowsills, stones left near wells, coded songs. You might smile at the rustic romance of it all, two people escaping to the fields, hands intertwined, breath steaming in the night air. But there's a rawness here too, an unglamorous truth. Medieval peasants weren't living out fairy tales. They were grasping for human connections in a world that rarely paused to let them have it. So if you ever find yourself transported back in time, staring up at a starlit medieval sky with the soft rustle of grain all around you, just know you're probably standing in someone's old bedroom. You've tied the knot, congrats. In the modern world, your wedding night might involve a hotel suite, dimmed lights, and perhaps a mildly overpriced room service menu. But in the Middle Ages, let's just say your wedding night might include witnesses, and not just metaphorically. You wake up married, but technically, you're not fully wed yet. Not until the union has been consummated. And in many medieval communities, that wasn't a private affair. It was communal business. Yes, that means someone, sometimes multiple someones, might be in the room when you and your new spouse attempt your first night of matrimony. Maybe they're peeking behind a curtain. Maybe they're sitting quietly in a corner, ready to shout, "It is done," like some awkward referee. In some cases, they even helped guide things along with prayers, advice, or awkwardly timed clapping. Not kidding. This strange custom had roots in the legal and religious obsession with ensuring the marriage was both valid and binding. You see, in the eyes of the church, a marriage wasn't just a contract, it was a sacrament. And for it to count, it needed to be physically sealed. In noble households, this often meant a ceremonial bedding. Guests would escort the couple to their chamber, singing songs, cracking jokes, sometimes physically helping them undress. The newlyweds would be tucked into bed like children at a sleepover, then left alone or mostly alone to do their duty. A quirky tidbit. In some medieval German regions, the bride's relatives would stay just outside the door, listening carefully. If all went well, the groom would toss out a stocking or a glove as symbolic proof of success. Cheers would erupt. Drinks would be poured. It was like medieval room service, but with more public pressure. Even among commoners, some traditions included showing proof the next morning, usually the bedsheets. Townsfolk would examine them for signs of blood, which was believed to confirm the bride's virginity and the couple's activity. Never mind biology's actual rules, medieval beliefs were more creative than correct. Historians still argue whether these customs were widespread or more ceremonial than real. Some claim they were symbolic gestures, not literal observations. Others point to case records and local statutes that treated consummation like a legal checkbox that needed proof. And what if there wasn't proof? Then things got messy. If a couple failed to consummate the marriage, it could be annulled sometimes with the help of a bishop, sometimes with the help of neighbors who gleefully testified that they heard no stirring in the night. Yes, people listened. They loved to listen. Remember, in a world without birth certificates or digital records, a couple's sexual activity was one of the few verifiable signs of marital legitimacy. So the community made sure it happened, or said it did. And for women, the stakes were higher. Failing to provide evidence of virginity could lead to dowry disputes, annulments, or worse, shaming, exile, or violence. Some brides were even subjected to inspections by older female relatives or midwives who would examine them for physical signs of purity. Spoiler, not a medically reliable practice. You lie there on your wedding night, the fire crackling, your heart pounding, and the distant sound of your uncle laughing too loudly downstairs. Maybe you're trying to focus. Maybe you're trying to forget that a deacon is technically on standby to sign the certificate. It's not intimacy, it's ritual, a fringe practice. In some noble courts, troubadours were paid to compose songs about the newlyweds' success, even if they weren't there. These ballads were performed at breakfast. Nothing says romance like waking up to a lute-powered summary of your night. So yeah, privacy didn't get a honeymoon. Instead, your most personal moment became a public guarantee. You weren't just proving love. You were proving legal and social alignment, fertility, purity, family pride, and maybe a little bit of medieval theatrics. It wasn't sexy, but it was official. You wake to the cold light of dawn and a crowd of nosy relatives demanding to see the bedsheets. Welcome to your first full day of marriage in the Middle Ages. In our modern world, post-wedding mornings involve brunch selfies and quiet recovery. But back then, it could mean inspections questions and a very awkward moment involving linen. You sit up in bed groggy, only to find someone outside the chamber asking, "Well, was the deed done and they're not joking?" Virginity wasn't just a personal detail, it was a political and economic checkpoint. For women, arriving at the marriage bed as a virgin was critical. Not for love or even religion, though the church did its part, but for money. A dowry, a financial sum, or property brought into the marriage could hinge on it. So what's the solution when trust doesn't cut it? Evidence. And that meant, yes, virginity tests and bed inspections. Let's break it down. In many European regions, it was customary to display the bed sheets after the wedding night. Family or even village elders might gather around as the linens were shown, ideally marked with a spot of blood believed to be proof of the bride's first-time status. Red stains meant honor. White sheets meant questions. Of course, you and I know human biology doesn't always cooperate. Not every woman bleeds her first time. But medieval folks had no time for nuance. In their minds, no blood equals no virginity equals betrayal. Some clever or desperate brides got creative. There are scattered reports of women pricking fingers, sneaking drops of animal blood onto sheets, or using herbs and concoctions to simulate the necessary evidence. One fringe record even mentions a woman using leeches. That's commitment. But for many, the pressure was real and relentless. If a bride failed to pass this test, consequences followed. The groom might shame her, publicly refuse to pay her dowry, or demand annulment. In especially harsh regions, the woman's family might be fined, dishonored, or worse. Historians still argue whether these inspections were genuinely common or exaggerated in literature and law codes. Some evidence suggests they were more of a symbolic gesture, a way to settle gossip before it started. Others believe the practice was enforced with humiliating zeal in certain communities. Either way, the belief in proof ran deep. In some French towns, local priests or midwives were tasked with performing actual physical inspections if virginity was in doubt. The idea of medical privacy. Laughable. Your body was community property when scandal loomed. This didn't apply only to brides. Grooms, too, had their performance under scrutiny, just from a different angle. If a marriage wasn't producing heirs, people got involved. Rumors might suggest the groom was impotent. Trials could be held. And in some medieval courts, men were ordered to demonstrate their virility in front of witnesses or be declared incapable of consummation. Yes, that happened. In one famous 13th century French case, a man accused of failing to consummate his marriage had to stand in court while physicians observed everything. They even applied warming ointments to test his physical reaction. Spoiler, it did not end well for him. Another case involved court-appointed examiners checking the husband's anatomy for proper dimensions. The result was annulment and a truly unfortunate nickname that followed him for life. And just when you thought things couldn't get more awkward, enter the chambre de parlement. This was a decorated side room, sometimes set up near noble weddings, complete with ceremonial sheets, witnesses, and tokens. It was like a medieval honeymoon suite, with spectators. The whole obsession reflected a world where your personal relationships weren't yours alone. Marriage was contract alliance ritual, and sex was its proof. So you sit nervously straightening the sheets. You hear murmurs beyond the door. Will they believe you? Will they demand to see more? Will they find enough evidence? A rooster crows. Someone knocks. The door creaks open. And as daylight pours in, you remember in the Middle Ages, privacy wasn't just rare. It was suspicious. You'd think that after your wedding night ordeal, you might earn a little peace. But in a medieval village, even the creak of a bed frame is everyone's business. You step outside your home modest wattle and daub walls, maybe a thatched roof, and nod politely to your neighbors. They nod back, but their eyes linger. You know what they're thinking. Did they hear anything? And if they didn't, why not? Sound carries in this world. Houses are small. Walls are thin. Most homes are single rooms where everything sleeping, eating, working, praying, arguing happens out in the open. If you so much as sneeze during dinner, 5 people know before dessert. So if anything more rhythmic happens at night, forget about subtlety. You head to the well for water, and 3 women are already there, chatting softly. You catch the tail end of a sentence, and then she just pretended to be asleep. Can you believe it? They glance in your direction and smile too sweetly. This, dear listener, is the power of medieval gossip. Information in this era moves not through phones or headlines, but by word of mouth. And news isn't necessarily war taxes or famine. It's you. What you wear, whom you're seen with, how late your candle burns, how often your spouse looks annoyed. And of course, anything overheard at night. For a newlywed couple, or anyone whose love life doesn't fit expectations, the scrutiny is intense. A neighbor might linger outside your window just long enough to hear a grunt or two. A child might report on how often your door latch clicks. And heaven help you if you accidentally leave a shutter open. In some towns, rumors were practically currency. If you knew who snuck into whose house last week, you could trade that information for favors, food, or protection. Gossip wasn't just a pastime. It was power. And not all whispers stayed whispers. Communities sometimes recorded moral behavior in church records, town rolls, or local customs. In England, for example, women known as scolds, loud or gossipy, could be punished publicly. And if you were the subject of gossip, it could trigger real consequences, from formal reprimands to lost business to public penance. Remember Marjorie, the alewife from 3 cottages over? She got caught meeting a traveling minstrel by the hedgerow. 2 weeks later, she's scrubbing the church steps as penance, wearing a sign that says, "Loose tongue, looser ways." Harsh, yes. Common more than you'd think. Historians still argue whether these social punishments were driven more by genuine moral policing or just petty village politics. Was it really about sin or about keeping people in their place? Either way, you're always on stage. And just when you think you've figured out the rhythm of discretion, quiet movements, muffled sounds, extra hay for soundproofing, someone decides your silence is suspicious. A married couple who doesn't make noise at night. Whispers begin. Are they not in love? Is he impotent? Is she barren? Is one of them sneaking off elsewhere? You can't win. Some towns even had literal eavesdroppers, people hired or encouraged to listen at doors and windows to report immorality. That's where the phrase comes from, standing under the eaves just out of sight, soaking up secrets. So much for intimacy. You walk back home with your bucket of water. A rooster crows somewhere. A child runs by, giggling. Behind you, an old woman leans on her broom, eyes narrowing as she watches your door. Inside, your spouse yawns, stretching beneath a blanket that barely counts as private cover. And as the morning light filters through the wooden slats, you realize you've never felt more watched. Even in your own bed with the door shut and your voice low, you're not alone. Because in the Middle Ages, even your silence made noise. You've made peace, or at least uneasy truce, with the idea that privacy is non-existent. But now it's time for Sunday confession, and things are about to get even less private. The church, ever watchful, doesn't just guide your spiritual life. It monitors your body, your habits, your urges, especially the urges. You step into the dim, incense-laced chapel. The stone is cold under your feet. The priest is already waiting, seated on a wooden stool beside a modest screen, hardly the high-backed, velvet-draped confessional you imagined. You kneel on the worn plank floor, heart pounding. "Speak, child," he says, and speak you must. In medieval Europe, confession isn't optional. It's mandatory, at least once a year, and not just for theft or lying. You're expected to confess sins of the flesh, lustful thoughts, unwed trysts, impure acts with your spouse, anything that deviated from the tight script of marital duty. Yes, that includes what happened last Tuesday night, when things got a little experimental. The priest might ask gently but firmly, was the act completed in the proper manner, or was it for pleasure alone? These weren't throwaway questions. The church drew rigid lines between acceptable and sinful intimacy, marital sex, only missionary position, no contraception, no pleasure for pleasure's sake. You shuffle awkwardly, trying to choose your words. Do you lie or admit everything? And here's the kicker: whatever you say in this quiet corner may not stay here. Sure, confession is theoretically confidential, but medieval society wasn't airtight. Priests sometimes dropped hints in sermons, veiled stories meant to guide the flock, but clearly aimed at real people. More troubling still, some sins made it into sin books. Moral registers kept by certain churches or monastic orders recording types of misbehavior across their parishes. They were anonymous, sort of. You won't see your name next to your confession, but the combination of timing, location, and detail makes it very guessable. A woman of good standing in the northern quarter confessed to, yeah, everyone knows it's you, Agnes. Historians still argue whether these sin books were genuine tools for spiritual reform, or just spicy reading for the overly righteous. But they definitely existed. Some even read like tabloid mashups. A merchant was caught fondling his servant in the counting room. A widow claimed nightly visits from her late husband. A youth admitted impure thoughts about poultry. Yes, that one's real. Outside the church, the gossip wheel spins faster. Local women gather at the communal oven, kneading dough and whispering. Did you hear Father Thomas mention someone biting during his sermon? I knew something was off about them. Gossip once again fuses with confession. The sacred and the social are deeply entwined. But confession wasn't always punitive. Some priests, especially the younger or more worldly ones, offered advice instead of judgment. They might suggest longer fasting, extra prayers, or oddly specifically abstinence on feast days. You try not to sigh. That's half the calendar. Sometimes confession became therapeutic. You spill your fears, your frustrations. The priest listens. For a brief moment, it feels like someone sees you, not just your sins, but your struggles. And yet there's always the threat of exposure. One wrong word, one loose-tongued monk, one over-curious neighbor, and suddenly your private turmoil becomes the village's latest entertainment. That's the problem with a world where everyone believes your body belongs not just to you, but to your spouse, your priest, your community, and God. Even your thoughts aren't safe. You return home, a penance assigned, and absolution granted. But as you pass the local tavern, a few heads turn. A knowing look. A chuckle. Did someone overhear your confession? Did your husband guess what you told the priest? You pull your cloak tighter. Privacy doesn't live here. Not in your home, not in your bedroom, not even in your own heart. So far, you've endured nosy neighbors, whispering priests, and cramped quarters. But you haven't yet faced the law. And in medieval Europe, the law doesn't stay politely outside the bedroom. Sometimes it climbs right into bed with you. Today you're summoned not to church, but to the manor court. It's not for theft, not for land disputes. It's for something far more intimate, a complaint that you haven't properly consummated your marriage. Yes, that's a legal issue. Across medieval Europe, especially in places like England and France, local courts were empowered to hear matrimonial cases, everything from accusations of adultery to, believe it or not, impotence trials. If a woman claimed her husband couldn't perform his duties, she could take him to court. And if he denied it, the court might demand a proof test. You sit in the crowded hall. Onlookers lean in. The bailiff reads out the case. Your name, your spouse's name, and the accusation. Some people shift in their seats. A few stifle laughs. The steward doesn't even blink. Now comes the strange part. A panel of matrons, local respected women, may be assigned to inspect the man. Yes, physically. In some cases, 2 physicians join them. The court wants evidence, not hearsay. Humiliating, absolutely. But it's not even the worst part. In particularly intrusive cases, the accused man may be asked to demonstrate his arousal capacity in front of the panel. Behind a curtain, if lucky, but sometimes not. Records from the 14th century detail such tests in uncomfortable detail. One poor soul in France was declared legally impotent because he remained unmoved despite the presence of stimulating women. Imagine having that on your record. Historians still debate whether these cases were frequent or simply sensational, but dozens are documented, and likely more were never formally recorded. And women weren't immune. If a marriage was never consummated, a husband could accuse his wife of withholding a legal category that sometimes led to annulment or community punishment. Even in court, there was often a not-so-subtle assumption that a woman's body was public property. Sometimes these trials turned into theater. Neighbors were called to testify. Did they hear signs of consummation? Was the bedclothes stained the next morning? In one infamous case, witnesses testified that no candles were extinguished after the ceremony. A clear sign, they claimed, that nothing happened. Then there's the bizarre world of annulments. In many parts of Europe, a marriage could be annulled, not just for adultery or abuse, but if it hadn't been physically sealed. A couple might live together for years, but if they never shared the bed in a legally acceptable way, the church might say, "Nope, doesn't count." Cue another courtroom, another round of intrusive questioning. And when adultery did occur, oh, the drama. In some Italian cities, if a wife was caught cheating, her lover could be fined or forced to marry her if the husband rejected her. In England, church courts could assign public penance, a white shift bare feet, paraded through the village square. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Remember Section 5's humiliating walk? The legal system loved turning morality into a spectacle. Even the secular courts got involved. By the 15th century, urban centers like Paris and London had vice squads officials tasked with monitoring moral behavior. Brothels were licensed, but private liaisons often illegal. A man caught with someone else's wife might be jailed, whipped, or worse. And women, the consequences were usually harsher. Sometimes you didn't even have to do anything. Just being alone in a room with someone of the opposite sex who wasn't your spouse could spark rumors and legal repercussions. You start to understand something chilling in this world. There's no such thing as intimacy without risk. Not only are people watching, you could be arrested for what they think they saw or what they didn't hear through the wall. Privacy isn't just a luxury, it's legally impossible. You trudge home after court, exhausted and embarrassed your fate pending a verdict. A neighbor smiles awkwardly. Someone mutters, "Hope he passed the test." You feel heat creep up your neck. Whether guilty or innocent, proven or not, the damage is done. Your reputation is now public record. Your bedroom is now a courtroom. And your body, it belongs to more than just you. You need a break from all this scrutiny. You wander the village streets hoping for silence, maybe solitude, but instead you find a laughing child pointing at a church wall. You follow his gaze. They're carved into the stone high enough to avoid casual repairs, but low enough to spot if you're looking is a lewd little scene. A man, a woman, a contorted goat. You blink. The child giggles again and runs off. Welcome to medieval marginalia. Turns out, even when sex wasn't private, it was also everywhere. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts on the walls of churches, even scratched into the wood of pews, tiny cheeky reminders that the human appetite, no matter how frowned upon, never really stopped expressing itself. Take medieval manuscripts. You'd think they'd be reserved for holy texts, royal charters, or deep theological debate. And they are. But peer into the corners, and you'll find naked figures jousting with certain appendages. Monks mooning each other. Nuns plucking phallic-looking vegetables from trees. Historians still argue whether these were jokes, protest boredom, or secret messages passed from one monk to another. One theory suggests they were a form of stress relief, a wink from the scribe after copying Leviticus for the third time. Another proposes they were moral warnings, albeit extremely confusing ones. Whatever the reason, they're there, etched in ink and paint for centuries to come. Even more startling, these images show up in cathedrals. That's right. Gigantic stone gargoyles and grotesques, sometimes portrayed in scandalous positions, jutting from the holy house like naughty bookmarks. At first you assume they're symbolic. Maybe representations of sin or warnings against lust. That's what some scholars believe. But others suggest they're simply leftover from a time when sacred and profane weren't quite as separate as we imagine today. And it's not just stone and ink. Wood tells stories too. In England, misericords, those little fold-down seats monks used during long prayers, often had carvings underneath. You'd expect biblical scenes. Instead, a drunk man vomiting, a monkey playing a lute, or two people doing something that definitely breaks at least 3 commandments. You run your hand over a wooden beam in the tavern. Someone scratched initials into it, followed by a crude drawing of what appears to be a knight and a milkmaid in a compromising embrace. A few more hearts, then the year 1327. You can't help but laugh. Some things never change. And yet this isn't simply graffiti. It's a kind of public record. When people don't have private space to talk, joke, flirt, or even fantasize, they leave marks. Marks that survive. Marks that remind us of the universal, unchanging weirdness of being human. One oddly famous example, the Green Man. You've probably seen him carved into medieval churches, a face emerging from leaves, vines curling from the mouth or eyes, sometimes solemn, sometimes cheeky. Scholars have never agreed on what he represents. Pagan fertility, Christian resurrection, a joke from a bored stonemason. No one knows for sure, but what's clear is the medieval world had no problem embedding mystery, mischief, and even sexuality into sacred spaces. It wasn't a contradiction, it was just life. And that brings you to the art. Medieval art didn't aim for realism. It aimed for meaning. But sometimes the line between meaning and innuendo blurred fast. Take the Luttrell Psalter, a richly illustrated manuscript from the 14th century. Alongside saints and psalms, you'll find a man bending over while another, let's just say he's holding a trumpet. Whether it's satire symbolism or pure silliness is still debated. The best part, these weren't hidden. They weren't censored. They weren't Easter eggs for later historians. They were just part of the visual language of the time. A flick of the wrist, a twist of the vine, a small grin behind a gargoyle's stony eyes. These images watched everyone praying, confessing, even marrying, reminding them, and now you, that nothing was truly secret. And don't forget oral culture. Bawdy songs, riddles, and tales flew freely across markets and hearths. Some of Chaucer's dirtiest jokes didn't even make it into modern translations, but they lived on in songs passed down like gossip wrapped in rhyme. Even within strict religious frameworks, people found ways to joke. Saints' lives were copied dutifully, but then retold at inns with winks and knowing chuckles. Ever heard the one about the bishop, the donkey, and the miller's wife? Let's just say it's not safe for a candlelit setting. But here's the twist. None of this was considered shameful the way modern minds might think. Medieval folks didn't compartmentalize public and private, sacred and vulgar quite the way we do. To them, life was a tangle of the divine and the ridiculous, the holy and the human, all crammed together like the crowd in your one-room cottage. So you step back from the wall, away from the carved chaos. Behind you, the bells ring out for vespers. In front of you, the world continues a little crude, a little crowded, but unapologetically alive. You're up early again, not by choice. The town cockerel and 2 very loud goats have taken it upon themselves to wake you. You shuffle toward the public well, hoping for a moment's peace. No luck. 3 women are already there, gossiping loudly, while scrubbing linens and exchanging scandalous tales. You try not to listen, but let's be honest, it's impossible. You catch phrases like, under her skirts, and right there in the grain shed, And suddenly it hits you, medieval gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. In a world without privacy, your reputation was your lifeline. Gossip was how reputations were formed, maintained, destroyed, and rebuilt. If someone knew when, where, and with whom you'd rolled in the hay, chances are the whole village did too by sundown. There were no secrets. In a town where walls were thin, doors were always open, and windows, mostly just holes with cloth. Whispered stories traveled fast, and soon they weren't just about what people did, but what they might do next. One of the women at the well turns to you with a twinkle in her eye. You're the one who sleeps near the blacksmith's fire, right? You nod cautiously. Herdy snores like a warhorse. The other two cackle. You force a polite smile, but inside you're panicking. What else do they know? This isn't just idle chatter. It's social surveillance. And it got institutional, too. Church courts, especially in England and parts of France, ran what were known as matrimonial inquisitions. If a woman claimed a man had promised marriage after sex, witnesses would be summoned. Neighbors often, who would testify about noises, clothing, even whispered conversations overheard through the walls. Historians still argue whether these courts empowered women or merely exposed them to further shame. Either way, they show how personal lives weren't personal. They were public record preserved by your neighbor's ears. Even the church relied on gossip. Ever heard of the Sin Eater? A fringe figure in rural communities, especially in the British Isles. He'd symbolically consume the sins of the recently dead by eating bread placed on their chest. People whispered about who had hired one, and why was there something unconfessed, something scandalous. And then there were the local penitential books lists of sins and the punishments assigned to them. Some of them read like medieval tabloid columns for coupling with a nun, 7 years fasting on bread and water, for relations in the churchyard, 15 lashes and public prayer. One particularly famous text, the Penitentiale Theodori, laid out rules so specific, it makes you wonder who exactly needed such tailored advice. Like if a man kisses another man in lust, let him do penance for 5 days. Or if a woman mounts a man like a horse. You get the idea. Again, these weren't written for fun. They were public standards guiding how people should behave and reminding everyone who was watching when they didn't. Which brings us to the punishment part. Say you did get caught doing something improper. Say behind a grain sack with someone else's spouse. You wouldn't get a quiet scolding. No, you'd likely face public penance. This might include standing in church wrapped in a white sheet, confessing aloud, while others stared. Or worse, you might have to walk through town barefoot, wearing nothing but a wooden sign spelling out your misdeed. Adulterer, fornicator, goat lover. Okay, that last one's rare, but never say never. The point. Shame was a public performance. Everyone had a role to play. Yours, unfortunately, involved a lot of blushing and probably some pebbles in your sandals. And the church wasn't the only institution tracking your escapades. In larger towns, local magistrates kept moral order with harsh and very visible punishments. Stocks in the town square, for example, weren't just for thieves. They were used for lewd behavior, indecent exposure, or simply being a little too affectionate in public. Of course, the rich had some wiggle room. A lord caught in scandal might pay a hefty fine or arrange a swift marriage to silence tongues. But peasants, you lived under a microscope. Your life was a series of witnesses and whisperers, all armed with sharp memories and sharper tongues. Some medieval towns even had official roles like the scold's bridal enforcer, a punishment device for women deemed too mouthy or prone to gossip. It was a metal cage locked around the head with a tongue press inside. It was designed to shame silence and display, a kind of cruel irony punishing the same tool that kept the town's social fabric together. And yet, despite all of this, gossip was also connection. It was how people processed their world, laughed together, warned each other, bonded. A racy rumor passed in the alehouse wasn't always malicious. It was often the only entertainment around. One minute it's, "I heard she met the abbot behind the stables," and the next it's, "Did you hear he got caught wearing her wimple?" By bedtime, you can barely remember what was true and what was embroidered beyond recognition. But you know this: nothing you do say or even think here goes unnoticed. And honestly, that might be more terrifying than the rats. You've made it through weeks in this medieval village now, and if you've learned anything, it's that solitude is a myth. Even at your most private, someone is watching, listening, or at the very least whispering about it by the next sunrise. Today, it all reaches a surreal peak. You're sitting on a log behind the bakehouse, trying to enjoy a crust of bread and the rare illusion of being alone. But you're not. Two children round the corner stop dead in their tracks and shout. Mum says you're the one who sleeps late and talks in your dreams. Fantastic. Your REM cycle is now public knowledge. You sigh and glance toward the square. There, on full display, is a man kneeling in penance, hands, folded hair dusted with ashes, while a clergyman recites a list of transgressions loud enough to wake the town goats. Some of the crowd snickers. Others nod solemnly. A few take mental notes for later gossip. You don't dare laugh. You could be next. In this place, the public and private aren't opposites. They're partners. Everything you do is part of a communal rhythm, from sleeping in shared lofts to bathing in public rivers, to confessing in echo-prone wooden booths. Your life is out there, raw and visible. And yes, that includes sex. The town midwife. She knows more than just childbirth. She's the unofficial chronicle keeper of who's coupling, who isn't, and whose condition is now requiring secrecy. Her whispered consultations might save reputations or shatter them. And then there's the ritual of charivari. Imagine this: a newlywed couple suspected of marrying under sketchy circumstances, say a pregnant bride or a suspiciously sudden engagement, is serenaded by a nighttime parade of banging pots, off-key songs, and crude jokes. Think medieval bachelor party meets public trial. It was a celebration, sort of. A loud, mocking, impossible to ignore way of saying, "We're watching." Historians still argue whether charivari was truly punitive or just chaotic folk theater, but one thing's clear. It blurred the line between moral judgment and crowd entertainment. Even literature joined the act. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 14th century, doesn't shy away from scandal. The Miller's Tale. It's a bawdy, gleeful romp about extramarital trickery and windows that reveal just a little too much. It wasn't just written for nobles. Common folk enjoyed these stories too, perhaps because they so closely resembled the rumors shared by hearthfire glow. And what about art? In the margins of medieval manuscripts, the famously bizarre marginalia, you'll find monks doodling the unthinkable nuns, harvesting phallic-shaped vegetables, animals behaving badly. And yes, even monks getting a bit too cozy with barrels. These drawings weren't official doctrine, but they reflected the very human undercurrent of the age, equal parts irreverent, curious, and incapable of keeping a secret. So much for the prudish Dark Ages myth, right? Even the architectural spaces betrayed this collective lack of privacy. In noble homes, the soul or a private room was a luxury. Most people lived, slept, and did everything else in the hall, a large shared space. Curtains could offer symbolic privacy, but they didn't block noise or smell. One historian jokes that medieval privacy was more like the illusion of a polite pause, a moment of pretending not to notice rather than truly not seeing. There were efforts, of course. The church insisted that sex within marriage should be private, quiet, and purposeful. But enforcing that, not so easy when your neighbors slept 6 feet away and could hear everything. So people got creative timing things for early dawn, layering blankets to muffle noise, or sneaking out to barns, woods, even graveyards. Yes, graveyards. That's not a joke. There are documented instances of couples choosing churchyards for privacy, an ironic twist hiding from society among the dead. By now you understand sex in the Middle Ages wasn't hidden behind closed doors because there were no doors. It wasn't taboo so much as tightly regulated by faith, law, rumor, and the sheer density of daily life. And even when people tried to keep secrets, someone always heard. Someone always saw. It all leads to this final, uncanny realization. In medieval Europe, you were never alone. Not truly. Your community was your constant shadow, sometimes protective, often intrusive, occasionally kind, but always present. The idea of privacy as a right, that's modern. Back then it was a luxury or a fantasy. So as night falls and you lie again on your straw mattress, shoulder to shoulder with strangers and would-be gossips, the flicker of candlelight casting crooked shadows across the beams. You close your eyes and think, would you trade the warmth of this tightly woven world for silence? Maybe, but not tonight. You roll over trying not to snore, because someone's always listening. Word count 168. Wind down 300 words. Let your breath slow now. You've traveled far through winding village lanes, candle-lit chambers, and gossip-strewn squares. The clamor of medieval life is finally fading. The laughter, the whispers, the restless scrape of straw beneath shared beds. They soften into echoes. You're not a peasant anymore, not a scribe, not a barefoot confessor in the stocks. You're simply still. Let that quiet sink in. The flickering torches that once lined the hallways gutter low. The rhythmic creak of cartwheels and bells of distant vespers dissolve into silence. Even the goats are asleep. Take a moment here, at the edge of a world that never truly turned off. A place where you could vanish into a sea of faces and yet never escape their gaze. Strange, isn't it, how comforting that closeness can feel when the lights go out. The candle by your cot burns lower. Its flame shudders, barely holding on like the last note in a song. Let it go. Wherever you are, on a couch in Singapore, a bunk in Toronto, maybe curled under covers in a shared dorm room in Lisbon, know this: for all its noise and nosiness, that medieval world had one simple truth at its core. We survive best when we're seen, when we're known, even if that knowing sometimes comes wrapped in jest or judgment. Now let sleep take you. No more whispers. No more bells. Just breath and the hush of history sliding closed behind you like a wooden door on oiled hinges. You're safe. You're home. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.